To the UK press intro of the new 890 Adventure and 890 Adventure R. We're going to talk about these two bikes in separate videos. So to start with, I'm going to talk about the 890 Adventure and the changes that have happened to that. And in another video, we're going to talk about the 890 Adventure R and how the new engine and the changes to that bike affect it. For this press test, they split the riding into road and off-road with the two different bikes. So the 890 Adventure, we've only ridden on the road really, on street tires. And KTM are kind of, as they did with the 790 Adventure when it came out, have pitched this bike as like a gravel adventure bike, but a little bit more leaning towards street riding. And one of the more interesting things, if you've watched the review that we did of that bike, is that I think it was really heavily focused on street performance and being really, really good for someone who wants to push the boat a little bit more on the street side of things. That bike was fantastic. If you like to ride hard, you really wanted to push on the road a little bit more, you were a relatively aggressive rider, but what it wasn't was a rounded adventure bike in the way that maybe the 790 Adventure R was. It was a lot stiffer, the compression was really hard on the fork, it was really stiff on the rebound, and that meant that on a twisty, tight mountain road or something a little bit quicker, it performed fantastically well. However, when you got it into more Nadgery lanes, the rebound and the compression being a bit stiff made it a little bit twitchy and a bit uncomfortable. If you rode it in town, the shock was quite harsh. And as a result, it didn't feel like that rounded of a bike. It wasn't a bike that you would classically call an adventure bike. It felt very much almost like a Duke version of an adventure bike. I think I even said that in the original review. And when it comes to the 890, the predominant changes that they've made are to make the engine in theory a little bit more rideable, and they've made some nondescript changes to the suspension. On the engine front, they went up in capacity with the goal of making a little bit more power, giving it a little bit more torque. They made a bunch of other changes which are technical, and you can read about those in the description. We'll put a link to the official information. They're way too complicated for this video, but the end result is a bike that is, I think, mildly improved on the road. It's essentially still the same bike. The chassis is the same. And when it comes to the engine and its rideability, the one thing that it's gained over the previous edition is a little bit more torque low down. I think overall it's a much nicer engine, and I think this showed through more riding this 890 on the road than it did riding the 890 off-road. For me, the biggest thing that it's gained is an ability to use a broader spectrum of the gear that you're in. So if you want to run a taller gear and sit lower in the RPM, this is now a bike that really enjoys doing that. Before, I think it was much more comfortable and it worked much better as a package. If you were high in the revs, you revved it hard, you rode it hard, it worked really well, and the whole bike seemed a little bit more in harmony. Whereas now, I think that shift has come much lower in the RPM, and it feels nicer when you pull a tall gear, you roll through the corners a little bit more, you ride it less like a street bike and more like an adventure bike. It just works better. There's a little bit of a strange thing as well, especially we rode quite a lot of single track roads today. With tight hairpins in them, and if you go down too many gears, when you go to come on the throttle, if you're in a low gear, there's a weird lag. So if you roll on in first gear in a tight hairpin, it's kind of hard to find the point at which the throttle engages. And then when it does come in, because you're searching for it, it's a little bit abrupt. Whereas if you run a gear higher, the throttle position seems a little bit more consistent. It works much nicer. The other thing that this new engine has over the older one is because it pulls harder from down low, it seems to pull forever. Like it starts low and it pulls really high in the rev range. It's ballistically quick. It's 105 horsepower now. It's just 10 up on what it was. It's just fast, man. Like it's mind melting a little bit. You kind of end up at a point where you're going much, much quicker than you realize you are because of that. I don't really know how to describe it any better than it's fast, and it's faster than most adventure bikes, and it does it in a much more linear way. Maybe a little bit of that's because it's quite free revving, but overall it's just a really, really good street bike, and it's a little bit better than it was. I mentioned it back at the start, but The other thing that needed a bit of a tweak in my eyes, and I said this quite a lot in my previous review, was I felt the suspension for an adventure bike was a little bit too focused, a little bit too stiff on the compression, a little bit too stiff on the rebound, and it worked in some places and it definitely didn't work in the others. And I think KTM have improved that. It's a bit difficult to tell because we're not riding them back to back and we didn't really get that much time on them. But for me, it's a tiny bit more compliant. So it deals with those small bumps a little bit nicer. It doesn't get as upset. The shock definitely feels a little bit better than the old one. When you hit something like a bump in the road, it doesn't get as upset. It doesn't hit as hard as it used to. And overall, that for me makes it a more rounded bike. This bike is already a really good street bike. If you're into adventure bike riding and you like to ride fast on the road, this is already one of the best bikes on the market, and now it's a little bit more rounded, and I think that's ultimately a good thing. As for the rest of the performance, what it works like on off-road and so on, we didn't really get to test that, and we'll cover that in a much more detailed review at some point in the future. But for now, if you're a current 790 Adventure S owner, this is the same bike that you had, with those two things changed a little bit. They've just moved the needle towards a little bit more compliant and a little bit less focused. And I think that's a good thing if you had those same issues with the bike that I did. I hope this video has been informative for you. If it has, and you liked it and you want to see more adventure bike reviews, then hit that like button, subscribe to our channel and all that other stuff. And if you're really interested in finding out a little bit more about the new 890 Adventure R, we've got a video on that as well, so you can click that up in whichever corner that's in.